So today we're going to take a look at how to make this slightly stylized wood texture, and we're going to give it a polish parameter that will allow us to increase or decrease the polish. And then as that parameter falls below 0.5, it's also going to start weathering the wood by reducing the saturation of the color. And this way, as it gets completely rough, it's also lost a bit of its color and it's lost all of its sheen. And if we take a look at the material here in Substance Designer, we can see that it's actually just been created using these 4 masks, which we put some color onto using a gradient map, and then we create our various outputs. We only have the one input parameter that we're going to be using, and that means we're going to have to do a lot of adjusting and a lot of repetition, and slightly different tweaks for each one of these. And to make our life easier doing that, we're also going to create these 2 functions, these 2 little standalone functions that we can use to make our life much easier when we're building out our functionality here in the material. So without further ado, let's get started in building our new substance. I'm going to use the PBR template here, and we will call this Basic Wood, and we'll click OK. Before we're going to do anything else, we're going to mess around with our outputs a little bit here. First of all, I like my height near my normal, so I'm going to do that. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this metallic, and rather than just deleting it, I'm going to change it to my specular level. And the specular level is actually going to determine the reflectivity of the material that we're making. So while the roughness talks about how smooth or rough something is, the specular level will be talking about its mirror-like qualities. So the higher the spec level, the more like a mirror it's going to behave. The other output node that we're going to need is going to be an ambient occlusion. So for that one, I'll make a brand new one, and we will assign its use here, and then we will put in its identifier, and we'll put in a label. And that is our output node done. So the first mask we're going to build is going to be what I'm calling my color grain mask. And as the name would imply, it's only really going to deal with the color output. It's not really going to be part of any of the other outputs directly. And what it's designed to do is to deal with the sort of tonal variations between each of the 2 color groups in the wood. It's just there to give it a more naturalistic look. We're going to start, well, we might as well get this grunge map, which we're going to use. The basis of it is going to be a tile generator. And the idea here is to set up a series of striations. And just for brevity's sake, I'm going to put in the things that I came up with. But this is not a right or wrong answer. The key is I just want stripes. So whatever it is, the X amount is going to be 1. And then depending on how many stripes you want, you're going to put in however many Y tiles you want. And I settled on 5, but that's not necessarily what you have to do. We're going to use a bell, which is a much rounder, more natural shape. And we do want our symmetry random. And now we're going to set up these interstices spaces between our various elements here. And I do want them both random completely. So we'll set that all the way up. And then the other really key thing here is we want this going all the way across. And to do that, I'm going to set this scale up to 2. Which makes it twice as wide, which means that it cuts off at the edge, and that's exactly what I want. And let's put some randomization on this as well. Now we're going to offset it. And again, you can do whatever number you want here, but these are the numbers I'm going to use. And I do want it random, but not too random. If you do it too random, things go completely off kilter. So I settled on that. And then finally, I want my position to randomize, but only on the X. And now I've got this sort of template for more or less how wood grains work. It's kind of undulating back and forth. And we will now start manipulating and warping this in order to give us those tonal differences in our wood. And I come back here and I'm going to get a Gaussian noise. And I'm going to set that down so it's bigger. And we're going to get a warp node. Because I now want to take this and sort of get it to be not quite so perfect anymore. We're going to really lower that down. So it's literally not quite perfect. But we're still getting that undulation more or less exactly how we put it in with the tile generator. The other thing I'm going to want is a clouds 2, because now we're going to warp this again. Well, actually, we're going to use this as the basis for warping clouds 2, but now we're going to really ramp it up. And those clouds are now smeared out according to what I created with my tile generator. And this is starting to look like wood grain. We're not, it's a little too symmetrical to truly look like wood grain, so we're not going to use this as our grains, but you could use this as a basis for a very fancy kind of wood if you wanted to. But we're not. We're going to keep moving with this. I'm going to get a levels node. And I'm going to tighten this up a little bit. And then we're going to get another warp. And this time, actually I'm looking at this, it's probably a little too tight. But this time, this is where this grunge map comes in. I want to start breaking it up on the vertical. Right now all these lines are very smooth in the up and down. They're all very, very horizontal. And I want to get some more undulation in that direction. And in order to do that, I'm just going to warp it against something horizontal. And I think this is actually a really good texture to do it by. However, after testing it, I found that for my taste, they were too close together. So I just grabbed a transform 2D node in here, and I only widened it. I left the height exactly the same, but I just doubled its width. And we don't really care about tiling because we're just using it to warp, so that's fine. And now we can bring this all the way down because we really don't want it to do it a lot. We just want a slight warp here, like that or that. So it's basically the same thing as here, only it's no longer quite so perfectly flat, which gives it more of a naturalistic look. And finally, we're just going to give it a bit of a blur to sort of soften it up a bit. And again, nothing much, but we're going to use it kind of, again, we're using it to undulate colors, and we don't want those edges sharp. And that is our first mask done. So we're going to draw a frame around it. And we will call this color grain masks. The next mask I want to do is actually going to deal with our wood grain, the rings themselves. And we're going to use the same idea. It's just going to be less busy. Copy this, paste it out. And what we're going to do is we're going to just change the settings on this one to reflect what I need for my wood grains. So instead of 5 here, we're going to put a 2. And that's going to really, really simplify what's going on here. We're going to keep the pattern as a bell. All this stuff will keep the same. except now on our horizontal size, we're going to go all the way up to 1, and our x interstice we will set down to 0. And our y we're going to bring up to 0.66. And we're going to keep that as random. And now we're going to ramp this scale up even more to 2.55, which is going to give us these much bigger bands. And we're also not going to have it be quite so random in its scale. I don't want them exactly the same size, but I want them more or less the same size. So we'll set this to 0.12 is what I had in my notes. And my X position, I keep random, but I don't want it offset anymore. And I actually think I want more black in there, so I'm going to increase that a little bit. I wanted to see more clean black in there because I'm actually now going for grayscale variation in here. I want a nice even slope going more or less according to this, and I don't want too many bumps or anything like that, which is nice. I've got what I want now. And the reason is, instead of warping it against something very mushy like clouds, what we're going to do is we're going to create a much more controlled take on what's going on in this very gentle gradient. We're going to start chopping that gradient up using a gradient editor. And we're going to start chopping it up by creating a series of bands by alternating the way that we put this gradient together. Okay, that'll do for now. So we now have this series of wood rings, which are still way too smooth and perfect, but it's giving us this beginning of something that's actually looking like wood grain as opposed to random cloudy stuff. And now it's just a question of taking this and messing it up a bit. And we can use a purlin for that. So we'll get a purlin noise, and let's make that sort of much bigger. And we'll get a warp. And we can warp this grain against the purlin noise, which starts to make it look more like wood. I mean, but it's still looking very, very perfect. And one of the things we can do to fix that even more is go ahead and to a certain extent incorporate it with what we have going on in here. So I'm going to get another transform because I want to do it actually at a different size than this. But I'm going to take the results of this color grain mask in here and we'll just double it. And then we can get another warp and warp the results of this against that. And that breaks it up a little bit more even. Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to get this not to look like perfect sort of grayscale gradients. And this then, for the moment, becomes our wood grain. I think I want to make this a little bit more gentle. So I'm going to add a levels node in here. I'm going to double click on my results, single click on my levels node, and I want to soften this up a little bit. Because that warp is a little rough, it's a little jagged. I think I like that much better. because I do want them more or less straight because they are wood grains. Maybe even a blur. There. So it gives it more variation within the line, but it's not actually giving me a jagged line. So we now have the wood grain for our polished wood. But since we're going to be putting in a toggle that's going to allow us to unpolish the wood, what I also want to do as we weather this wood is to break this grain up even more. And in order to do that, we need to warp it again against a noise. I went through the library and I really didn't find anything appropriate because we need something very specific here. We want something that's going to break it up, but is going to do it at more or less the same angle as our wood grain is moving. And that really requires making our own effects map. So that's what we're going to go ahead and do. I'm going to bring in my effects map. I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to click Edit Effects Map. And here I have this quadrant. I'm just going, again, I'm going to go ahead and put in a bunch more of these guys. And the more of them I put in here, the smaller my image becomes. And finally, we are going to put in 2 more quadrants down here. I'm just making another duplicate, but I'm going to sort of split it up at the end here. And that's because I want to kind of create this X. So they're both of these are going to do exactly the same thing. Only one of them is going to turn it in one direction and the other one is going to turn it in the other. And this will give us this very shallow crosshatch. So the 3 parameters we actually want to change is, well, let's add our pattern. We're going to use a paraboloid. And we also forgot to turn this into a grayscale, which is something I always do. Come back in here. We're going to want to change the offset, the size, and the rotation. We could go ahead and put a separate function on each one of these, but instead I'm going to put it all on this first one, and we're going to use a sequencer and we're going to set variables in order to do all the calculations on this first function and then shoot the instructions out down the line, because Substance is always going to look at this one first, this one second, etc., etc. So I'm going to create an empty function in here, and the first thing I'm going to do is reassign this color luminosity, which I want at 1. So I'm going to get a constant float 1, and then I'm going to get a sequence node, and this will be my final sequence node, and this will be the result after all the calculations are done. Let's come back to our quadrant here and look at the first thing we want to do. So the first thing we want to do is set up our pattern offset. And that's relatively simple because all we really want to do is just make this random. So we just want a random number here and a random number there. Come back into our color luminosity. We'll get a float. We could actually use the same one, but it might get complicated. I just want this one at the end. I don't want to have to think about it anymore. And then we will get a random. And we're actually going to duplicate that one out because we're going to, well, I mean, I want 2 different random numbers. I don't want my X and my Y to be the same. So this will generate 2 random numbers between 0 and 1, but they're both float 1, so we have to vector them down to a float 2. And this is what I want to be my offset. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to get a variable, and I'm going to set a variable. And this means I'm assigning the name to this variable, and I'm going to call it pattern offset. I'm going to copy it because I'm a lousy speller. I'm going to come back into my quadrant. I'm going to go into my pattern offset, create an empty function, get my variable float2, and in here I'm going to paste that function name and then set it as my output node. Not forgetting to set the end of my sequence here as the output node at this end. And now these have become randomized. But they're all round and they're all the wrong shape. But we're starting at the top and we're going to be moving down. So this is going to be the first thing that we're going to look at. Now, I'm going to need another sequencer in here because I'll be adding another function in a second. We come back out here to our quadrant and let's see what's next. Next thing we want our pattern size. Now, I don't want them round like this. I want them kind of squeezed out. So we're going to do something a little bit. We're not going to do just random sizes here. We're actually going to do something that's going to limit the height of the paraboloid. So for their size, I want to create a function that's going to stretch it out. I'm going to grab a couple more of these. So I'm just going to make a duplicate of that. And again, at this point, I'm going by the numbers that I have in my notes because that's what I ended up with. Rather than going through the experimentations of how I got here, I'll just use these and we'll talk about what's going on. We're going to get a random and we're going to get a comparison less than, well, lower or equal. And finally, we're going to get an if-else. So right now, we're talking about the x. So we're talking about the width, or the length of it, rather. I want it to be long. So we're going to get a random number between 0 and 4. But I also don't want it to be too small. So I'm going to limit its lower end size to 0.85. So it'll go a little bit smaller than 1, but not by much. So I've set up this statement. If this number is less than, if the result of this randomization is less than or equal to 0.85, so that's our condition, then 0.85, because I don't want anything smaller than that. Otherwise, I want to see this number. And that's going to be my x direction. Since we're going to do the same idea for the y, I'm just going to copy this and paste it out. But we're going to switch the numbers around. So now I want them like really small. So again, I'm just putting in the numbers that I had in my notes. But you can adjust the sizes according to what you want. And now we're saying that this random number between 0 and 0.26, if it's smaller than that, then 0.16, which is my floor, that's my first one. Otherwise, be no larger than 0.26. So I've set up these two results, one for my x, one for my y, and now I'm going to vector them into a float2. And again, I'm going to set a variable, and this one I'm going to call pattern size. I'm copying that, and I'm going to come into my quadrant. I'm going to go into my pattern size. Now, notice it's not showing up on this drop down. That's why I cut and paste it, because when you're setting a variable, you actually have to do it the longhand way. So you make an empty function, you add your node, and then because it's not on the drop down, you have to paste that in and then set it as your output node. We'll come back in here and we will sequence this in now. So I want this to happen first. Oops. I want this to happen first, this to happen second, and then my final result is my luminosity. And you'll see that we've now stretched these guys out. So some of them are, small, but they're all very narrow, and some of them are quite long, and some of them are kind of short. The next thing we want to deal with is our pattern rotation. And this is why I ended up having to make this custom FX map, because we've got our grain moving horizontally like this. And this is going to be the chips that have been taken out of the wood as it's weathered. So, they kind of have to go along with the grain of the wood. They can't be going off at 90 degrees. So we want them to have randomization on their rotation, but really no more than, like a couple of degrees in either direction. So it'll create a crosshatch, but like in this narrow range. And that's the final thing that we have to put in here. So it's going to be random, but within a very narrow range. Let's move these guys back. We'll get another sequence node. And now we're going to set up our pattern rotation, which is going to be really simple. Actually, it's the simplest of them all. We want our constant. We want our random. And that's going to be it. And so we might as well get our set variable while we're at it. The number I came up with was 0.03. And now we're talking turns. So, it's just a couple of degrees. And we will set this as pattern rotation. And, oops, let's do it this way. So that happens first, this happens second, and then that is our result. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to come out here to my rotation, empty function, and set it as our output node. And that's now given us a random number, which is giving us this very shallow crosshatch. But you'll notice that it's only really going in the one direction. And that's really going to be the only difference between these two quadrants. I'm actually going to go ahead and delete this one. I'm going to duplicate this one. And I'll rehook that in, because that'll just save me having to do all that stuff all over again. Oops. And then what we're going to do is we're going to come into this one's function and just make that a negative 0.03. And this is going to give us that crosshatch, because now they can go in both directions. Now, the one thing I want to add to this is I want this denser. So I'm right-clicking. We're going to get an iterate node. And I'm going to right-click and set this as my root. And I'm just going to up the iterations. So it just becomes a denser noise. And this is going to be kind of the weathering scratches on my wood. So now that we've got our effects map done, we can finish up our wood grain. So we're going to get another warp. Let's turn that to a grayscale. We don't need that as a color. And we can hook these guys up. And we can tone down that warp. And it's going to be a very low number. Because really all we want to see happen is this. It's not really changing the way they are, it's just roughing them up. And then I'm going to get a levels node, and I'm going to get this much more black and white. And then a blend node. and that lighten blend. And that's going to accentuate what we've done with this warp. It's just adding some more stuff on top of it. And finally, we're going to get another blend. And we're going to kind of do the same thing on top here. And we're going to leave it alone because we're going to actually use this node later on to switch between our polished grain and our rough grain using the opacity. But we're not going to do that just yet. We're going to tidy this up. We're going to draw a frame around it. And that's our grain mask done. So now the only thing we really have left to do as far as our masks are concerned is to create two little ones that are going to deal with the specific sort of minutia of each section. We're going to have two sections. We're going to have the pale wood and then the rings. So we're going to use a darker color for the rings, and then we're going to have the paler areas be a lighter color. So these paler areas are going to have a shallower, much lighter, well, it's more about normals and that kind of thing. So that's going to be like a much finer noise in here. And then what we're going to use inside the grain is going to be a much deeper, rougher noise. So let's start with the top one. And like I said, it's a really fine noise. And I'm just going to go ahead and use a white noise. And we'll get it. Is this the right one? I want this one. And I'm going to get a transform 2D. Because these are like really round. So I'm going to stretch them out. So let's make this 300 on the width. And then let's make them smaller. So I brought it down by half 2 times after having made the width 300. And I'm going to put a levels node in here. And we're going to kind of even it out a little bit more. So we get this very shallow, grainy grain on it. And this is, we're going to call this our shallow. So I'm going to draw a frame there. The next one we're going to do is for the deeper gouges. Well, I mean, it's not even gouges. It's just if you ever look at wood, like the darker bits actually have a different texture to them. It's kind of longer and deeper. For this one, I used black and white spots number 1. And again, I got a transform 2D. And I just took this and I just really made the height much smaller. So I made 12.5% on the height. And that gives me like these gougy, very long things here. And a levels node to kind of separate them out a little bit to sharpen it up. That looks pretty good. And we can draw a frame around that. And we'll call this deep. And here we have our 4 masks. And at this point, we're ready to actually start building the basic wood material.